In late September 2011, 41-year-old Yvonne Baldelli arrived in the tropical haven of Bocas del Toro, Panama, alongside her boyfriend, 35-year-old Brian Brimager. To the world, it looked like the start of a beautiful new chapter, an exciting new life in a place where turquoise waters brushed against white sand, and the rhythm of island life promised freedom, peace, and adventure. Yvonne had left behind the stresses of her old life in California, dreaming of turning the page and rebuilding her future. Brian, a former U.S. Marine, seemed ready to start over too. With his charm and confidence, he quickly won Yvonne's heart. The couple dreamed of days filled with sunshine, laughter, and the serenity of island living. Brian's easygoing demeanor made him seem like the perfect match for Yvonne, who had already weathered her share of life's challenges. They imagined a future together, one free of complications, filled with simplicity and tranquility. But, as often happens, what appears perfect on the outside can sometimes be far from it. From the start, their new life in Panama was humble. They rented a modest room by a 5-unit hostel by the ocean. Yvonne brought along 2 sewing machines, hoping to start a small clothing line using local fabrics. Meanwhile, Brian spent his evenings playing guitar at nearby bars, earning meals and drinks with his music. Together, they tried to build something simple but meaningful in their new environment. Yvonne had her dog, Georgia May, a King Charles Spaniel who was always by her side, a piece of home she could lean on in an unfamiliar place. Locals often saw Yvonne and Georgia walking along the beach, the small dog trotting happily beside her. From Yvonne's emails to her sister Michelle, everything appeared picture-perfect. Her words painted a life of peace, bright mornings, warm breezes, and laughter. She spoke about the joys of island living, how much she loved the place she now called home. Yvonne had dreams. She was working on launching her clothing line, and Brian was content with his nightly music gigs. The couple seemed happy, content even, in their modest new life. But suddenly, everything changed. The emails stopped. At first, Michelle, her sister, thought little of it. Perhaps Yvonne was simply caught up in the excitement of her new life. After all, she had moved to a remote part of the world where internet access could be spotty. But days turned into weeks, and the silence grew louder. Michelle's worry quickly escalated into dread. Something didn't feel right. The bond they shared was too strong for Yvonne to simply disappear without telling her. And why would Yvonne leave for Costa Rica with someone she had just met? It seemed out of character. Still, Michelle tried to remain calm. But then came the call from Brian. He told Michelle that he had returned to the United States alone and wanted to pick up his car from her home. According to him, he and Yvonne had broken up, and she had supposedly run off to Costa Rica with another man. Brian explained that Yvonne ended their relationship after learning he had a child with someone else. This story didn't sit well with Michelle. Yvonne wasn't the type of person to vanish like that, especially without telling her. And why would Yvonne leave for Costa Rica with someone she had just met? It seemed out of character. Still, Michelle tried to remain calm. But then the months passed. Christmas came and went, and there was still no word from Yvonne. Yvonne had always been close to her family, and missing the holidays was completely out of character. The emails continued, each one offering some sense of relief, but always feeling strange, distant, as if they had been written by someone else. They lacked the warmth and detail Yvonne was known for. They were nothing like the messages Michelle had always received. The real nightmare began when Michelle's cousin, a tech-savvy computer expert, traced the IP addresses of Yvonne's emails. The first few had come from Panama, just as expected, but the later messages, the ones supposedly sent from Costa Rica, were another story entirely. They had come from Dana Point, California, the very place where Brian was living. The devastating truth was now undeniable. Brian had been using Yvonne's email account to fabricate messages, trying to convince everyone that she was alive and well, traveling the world. The real question now was what had happened to Yvonne. What was Brian hiding? And more importantly, what was he capable of? Like, subscribe, and comment below to share your thoughts on this twisted case.
The moment Michelle uncovered the truth about Yvonne's emails, everything began to unravel. The emails that were supposed to bring comfort now revealed a horrifying reality. Michelle had always trusted her sister's judgment. Yvonne would never disappear without leaving a trace. And yet, there she was, sending messages that just didn't add up. Brian's story about Yvonne running off to Costa Rica with another man was starting to feel more like a cover-up, and Michelle's instinct told her that the worst had happened. Brian's response to Michelle's concerns was cold, detached. He had returned to California alone, and when Michelle asked for more details, he insisted that Yvonne had simply moved on. She was no longer interested in their relationship, and according to him, she had packed up her things and left with someone she had met shortly after arriving in Panama. But Michelle didn't buy it. Yvonne had always been deeply committed to her family, and the thought of her just walking away without saying goodbye made no sense. Brian was insisting that everything was fine, but Michelle was growing more suspicious by the day. She had spent too many years trusting her sister's words, and this felt like a lie. And then that strange email arrived, the one that seemed to come from Yvonne herself. "Hi sis, just an update. Brian and I are no longer together. I should have trusted my instincts that he is a lying, cheating ass. I'm headed to Costa Rica with a man I met when we first got to Bocas." Michelle felt the blood drain from her face as she read those words. Something was wrong. Yvonne would never talk like this. It didn't feel like her at all. The tone was off. The words were too cold, too detached. Yvonne had always been a woman of great warmth, detail, and affection. But this was not her sister. Michelle reached out to Brian, pressing him for more answers. She demanded that he file a missing person report, but Brian refused. Instead, he continued to insist that Yvonne would contact them soon, asking them to wait. Michelle was having none of it. It was time for action. With a sense of growing urgency, Michelle turned to the one thing that might give her some clarity: technology. Her cousin, a tech-savvy computer expert, offered to trace the emails. It was a long shot, but Michelle was desperate. She needed answers. What they discovered shocked them both. The first emails, the ones from Yvonne's original messages sent in Panama, matched up. They had come from there. But then the later messages, the ones claiming she had left for Costa Rica, had a different story. The IP addresses from those emails didn't come from Costa Rica, not even from Panama. They came from Dana Point, California, the exact location where Brian lived. Michelle couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was clear now. Brian was using Yvonne's email account to send fake messages, trying to convince everyone that she was alive and well, traveling the world. The realization hit Michelle like a ton of bricks. Brian wasn't just telling lies, he was trying to create a web of deceit to cover up something far worse. The investigation into Yvonne's disappearance wasn't just about finding her anymore. It was about uncovering the truth of what had happened. Why had Brian been so adamant about keeping her family in the dark? What was he hiding? The more Michelle thought about it, the more her suspicion grew. Brian had insisted that Yvonne had left him, that she was fine and moving on with her life. But then why were her emails coming from his home, from his very location? The entire narrative was starting to fall apart, and Michelle knew she was onto something much darker than she could have imagined. Meanwhile, Brian's indifference to the investigation raised more questions. While Yvonne's family was fighting for answers, Brian remained eerily calm. He showed no concern for Yvonne's fate, not even bothering to join the search efforts or show any interest in helping the authorities. The coldness in his response was chilling. Michelle, however, wasn't backing down. She was determined to find out what happened to her sister. But as the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that the path to the truth wasn't just about finding Yvonne. It was about uncovering the man who had been hiding so many secrets. Michelle's heart was heavy with worry. She had already lost precious time, and the fear of what might have happened to Yvonne was eating away at her. What had Brian really done, and why was he working so hard to cover it up? Every answer seemed to raise more questions. As the investigation into Yvonne's disappearance continued, one thing was certain. The man her sister had loved, the man she had trusted, was now the prime suspect in her disappearance. But the truth would soon come to light. No lie could last forever. Like, subscribe, and comment below if you believe Brian is hiding something. What do you think happened to Yvonne? Stay tuned. This story is far from over.
The deeper Michelle dug into the mystery of her sister's disappearance, the more the truth began to reveal itself. The IP addresses in the emails were the first clue, but what came next would expose the darkness hiding beneath Brian's charming exterior. It wasn't just a matter of a missing person anymore. Michelle knew that Brian had been hiding something far more sinister. As the investigation progressed, the FBI started to focus on Brian. His story was beginning to crack. The emails from Yvonne's account had been traced back to his hometown, Dana Point, California, not Costa Rica, as he had claimed. That's when the agents turned their attention to his behavior. Brian's indifference to the investigation was troubling. He wasn't acting like a man whose girlfriend had just vanished. There was no urgency, no emotion in his voice when he spoke about Yvonne's disappearance. The FBI needed more evidence. They turned to Brian's past, looking for anything that could explain his cold demeanor. What they found was even more disturbing than they expected. Brian wasn't just hiding his emotions. He was hiding a double life. When investigators started to ask around, they discovered that Brian had been living with another woman, Kristen, and had a child with her. He had been hiding his relationship with Kristen from Yvonne, even though they were living together in California. Yvonne had been completely unaware of Kristen's existence, and Brian had kept his life with her a secret while he was with Yvonne. The revelation that Brian had been living a double life shocked Yvonne's family. How had he kept this a secret for so long, and why hadn't Yvonne known? Michelle couldn't believe it. The man who had promised Yvonne a new beginning in Panama had been lying to her all along. The man she loved had been keeping secrets, and now it seemed he was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect them. But the more the FBI uncovered about Brian's life, the clearer it became that his web of lies wasn't just about two women. It was about something far more dangerous. As they dug deeper into his time in Panama, investigators began to uncover evidence that suggested Brian's relationship with Yvonne had been abusive. Witnesses came forward, sharing stories about the couple's frequent arguments, Brian's heavy drinking, and his aggressive behavior when intoxicated. One bartender who'd seen Brian perform at a local bar recalled that Yvonne often sat quietly in the audience, looking uncomfortable. Another bartender remembered seeing bruises on Yvonne's face and suspected that Brian had been physically abusive. There were reports from the hostel owners where the couple had been staying. They'd heard the shouting from their room at night, followed by the sound of Yvonne's muffled cries. One owner even claimed to have witnessed Brian strike Yvonne. It was a chilling portrait of the relationship Brian had worked so hard to keep hidden. Behind the facade of the charming musician and the loving boyfriend was a man capable of violence. Yvonne's family began to understand that the picture Brian had painted of their life in Panama was a lie. It wasn't a peaceful island paradise. It was a place where Yvonne had been trapped in a toxic, abusive relationship. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Yvonne's disappearance wasn't just a case of her running off with another man. No, it was much darker than that. Yvonne had discovered Brian's lies, his secret family, his manipulative behavior, and she had planned to confront him. That confrontation, it seemed, had cost her life. But as the investigation continued, one thing was still missing – evidence. Without a body, without solid proof of what had happened to Yvonne, the case was just a web of suspicion and deceit. And as long as Brian denied any involvement, there was little the FBI could do. That's when a break in the case came from an unlikely source – Brian's own actions. His carelessness would be his undoing. Brian, in an astonishing display of recklessness, had sold a machete to a local man in Panama. He made a sickening joke about the sale, saying, "I only dismembered one stripper with it. It's hardly used." The comment, while grotesque, was enough to raise suspicions. Investigators tracked down the buyer and recovered the machete. Forensic testing revealed traces of blood under the handle. It matched Yvonne's DNA. The evidence was damning. Brian had not only killed Yvonne, but had gone to great lengths to cover it up, using the machete to dismember her body. He had tried to erase every trace of her existence, but his carelessness would be his downfall. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, it was becoming clearer that Brian's world was collapsing around him. His lies, his violence, and his attempt to cover up the murder were all catching up to him. The FBI now had enough evidence to make their move. Like, subscribe, and comment below if you think Brian's lies are finally catching up to him. What do you think of his careless actions? Stay tuned. This story is only getting darker. As the investigation into Yvonne Baldelli's disappearance continued, the pressure on Brian Brimager was mounting. Yvonne's family had now fully grasped the disturbing reality. The man they had trusted, the man Yvonne had loved, was likely responsible for her death. The police, armed with mounting evidence, were closing in on him, but without a body, there was still no concrete proof that could link him to the crime. That's when the real search began, the search for Yvonne's remains. Yvonne's family refused to sit idly by. They couldn't wait for the authorities to bring answers. They had already lost so much time. Michelle, Yvonne's devoted sister, took matters into her own hands. She and the rest of the family made the difficult decision to travel to Panama to continue the search. They knew they couldn't rely solely on Brian's story anymore. Something had to be done to find Yvonne. They couldn't just sit back and pray for a miracle. Arriving in Bocas del Toro, Yvonne's family launched their own search for her, armed with nothing more than determination and the hope that they could uncover the truth. They printed flyers, hung posters, and spoke to anyone who might have seen Yvonne during her time on the island. Volunteers from nearby islands joined the search. Even local fishermen used their boats to scan the coastline, hoping to find any clue that could lead them to Yvonne. But the search wasn't easy. The dense jungles and vast, rugged terrain made it nearly impossible to track down any trace of Yvonne. Yet the Baldelli family refused to give up. They held press conferences pleading for information, and their story was picked up by local news stations. The case began to attract more attention, and the island's tight-knit community rallied around Yvonne's family, offering support in any way they could. Despite all their efforts, Yvonne's remains remained elusive. It wasn't until the investigators began interviewing locals that a darker picture started to emerge. Those who'd seen Yvonne and Brian together spoke of frequent arguments, Brian's aggressive behavior, and his tendency to drink heavily. Some people recalled seeing signs of drug use, and others noticed bruises on Yvonne's face. It was clear to many that the relationship had turned toxic. One bartender, who'd often seen Yvonne in the bar while Brian performed, recalled that Yvonne would sometimes appear with visible bruises. She would try to cover them up with makeup, but the evidence was undeniable. When asked about one particular bruise beneath her eye, Yvonne had nervously laughed it off and brushed it aside. She didn't want to admit what was really going on, but it was obvious to those around her. The hostel owners, too, spoke up. They had heard shouting from Yvonne and Brian's room late at night, followed by Yvonne's muffled cries. One of the owners even admitted to seeing Brian strike Yvonne during a particularly heated argument. The picture they painted was not one of love and adventure, but of a relationship marred by violence, control, and manipulation. Yvonne had been trapped in a dangerous situation, and despite her best efforts to hide it from those around her, the truth was becoming clearer. As the investigation turned toward Brian, one fact became increasingly evident. He was not just a man who had lost his girlfriend, he was a man who had systematically destroyed her life, hiding his lies and cruelty behind a facade of charm. But as the authorities pieced together more of the puzzle, Brian's web of deception began to unravel. Then came the key piece of evidence that would change everything. It wasn't the witness statements or the emails that Brian had sent from Yvonne's account. It wasn't even the bruises on Yvonne's body. It was a machete. Brian had sold the weapon to a local man in Panama after Yvonne's death. In a sickeningly callous joke, Brian remarked that he'd only dismembered one stripper with it, as though he were casually discussing the tool's minimal use. That offhand comment was the moment that would unravel Brian's entire defense. Investigators tracked down the buyer and seized the machete, sending it off for forensic testing. What they found left no doubt. The machete, which Brian had sold, had traces of blood under the handle. DNA testing confirmed what investigators feared. The blood was Yvonne's. It became painfully clear. Brian had used the machete to dismember Yvonne's body. He'd killed her, then tried to cover it up by hiding her remains, and even went so far as to sell the weapon in an attempt to erase all evidence of his crime. This discovery shifted the case from a missing person investigation to a full-blown homicide case. The evidence against Brian was overwhelming, and yet he continued to deny any wrongdoing. But the more the FBI dug, the more his lies were exposed. Every piece of evidence only further incriminated him. The machete was the key that linked him to Yvonne's murder, and it was his own carelessness that had sealed his fate. The discovery of Yvonne's remains remained a haunting possibility, but the machete gave the investigators the smoking gun they had been searching for. They now knew that Yvonne's death had no accident, no disappearance. It was murder, plain and simple. Like, subscribe, and comment below if you think Brian's careless actions will be his downfall. What do you make to the machete discovery? Stay with us. This investigation is far from over.
The search for Yvonne Baldelli had taken a devastating toll on her family. For months, they had been desperate for answers, but every lead seemed to fall short. The truth had been buried under layers of lies, deceit, and manipulation. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, there was one crucial piece still missing: Yvonne's body. Without it, Brian Brimager could still deny his involvement in her death, and justice would remain out of reach. But as the investigation continued, the case began to take an unexpected turn. Despite Brian's denial and his attempts to cover up the truth, his carelessness would be his undoing. With the machete discovery and the overwhelming evidence pointing to him as Yvonne's murderer, the FBI began their final push to uncover the full extent of his crime. In the face of mounting evidence, Brian's lies were crumbling. His calm and collected demeanor started to crack as he was confronted with the reality of his situation. When FBI agents questioned him again, he repeated the same story about Yvonne leaving for Costa Rica. He insisted that she had taken all her belongings and left without warning. But the agents had already uncovered far too much for him to maintain that lie. The breakthrough came when investigators searched Brian's condo in Dana Point, California. Among the items they seized was a white laptop, the very same model Yvonne had owned. This laptop was supposed to have been in Yvonne's possession when she supposedly left for Costa Rica. But as investigators opened the laptop, they were stunned by what they found. It wasn't just the emails that Brian had sent from Yvonne's account, it was much more than that. The laptop held chilling photographs of Yvonne, some taken shortly before her death. In these images, Yvonne was clearly showing signs of abuse, with visible bruises on her face and body. These were the same injuries that local witnesses had described in Panama. But it wasn't just the photographs that left investigators shaken, it was what else was found on the laptop. A search of the device revealed something truly horrifying. Brian had been researching how to clean a bloody mattress. This was not the kind of search a grieving ex-boyfriend would make. It was a search made by a man who had taken his girlfriend's life and was trying to cover his tracks. The truth was becoming undeniable. But Brian's actions weren't just about cleaning up his crime scene. They were about controlling the narrative, about creating a version of events that painted him as the innocent party. He had used Yvonne's email account to send fake messages, convincing her family that she was alive and well, living a new life in Costa Rica. He had even withdrawn money from her bank accounts to make it seem as though she was still traveling. Brian had tried to erase every trace of Yvonne, but the evidence was now overwhelming. The FBI had pieced together the full extent of his lies, and they were ready to make their move. But it wasn't just the FBI that was bringing Brian down. Yvonne's family, especially her sister Michelle, had played an instrumental role in uncovering the truth. They had fought tirelessly for justice, refusing to believe Brian's lies, and their persistence had paid off. In 2013, Brian was finally arrested and charged with obstructing justice and making false statements in connection with Yvonne's murder. But the real breakthrough came in August 2013, when local residents in Panama made a heartbreaking discovery. After nearly 2 years of searching, Yvonne's remains were found in a dense patch of jungle. DNA testing confirmed what her family had feared. The remains belonged to Yvonne. The discovery of Yvonne's remains brought both closure and renewed grief to her family. They had finally found the truth, but the pain of losing her was immeasurable. Yvonne's remains were returned to her family, and they scattered her ashes at sea, the ocean she had always loved. Brian's arrest marked the beginning of his downfall, but the road to justice was not yet complete. In February 2016, after years of legal proceedings, Brian Brimager finally pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He admitted to killing Yvonne, dismembering her body with a machete, and hiding her remains in the jungle. It was a devastating moment for Yvonne's family, but it was also a moment of justice. Still, the pain didn't end there. Michelle, Yvonne's devoted sister, had been diagnosed with breast cancer and was growing weaker by the day. She recorded a videotaped deposition to ensure her voice would be heard in court, and her testimony became a crucial part of the prosecution's case against Brian. Tragically, Michelle passed away before the trial's conclusion in 2014, but her courage and determination helped secure justice for Yvonne. In May 2016, Brian was sentenced to 26 years in federal prison. The court described his crime as one of cruelty, control, and deceit, driven by his fear of losing the double life he had built. But for Yvonne's family, the sentence brought little solace. The pain of their loss was a wound that could never fully heal. And as for Yvonne's beloved dog, Georgia May, she was never found. Investigators believed that Brian killed the dog to further conceal the truth. If Georgia May had been seen wandering alone, it would have been clear that Yvonne had never left the island. In the end, Yvonne's family found some measure of peace. They had fought for years to uncover the truth, and they had finally succeeded. They had laid their sister and daughter to rest and ensured that her story would never be forgotten. But the emotional toll of their loss and the cruelty of Brian's actions would stay with them forever. Like, subscribe, and comment below to share your thoughts on this tragic case. Do you believe justice has been served for Yvonne? Let us know your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe for more investigative documentaries.